Good evening, Provost Director, colleagues, students, members of the Northeastern community. My name is Uta Poiger, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all this evening. I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities here at Northeastern, and it is my pleasure to introduce this fall's event in the Northeastern University campus series on conflict, civility, respect, peace, Northeastern Reflects. I will just give you a quick overview of the mission of this series. 2 winters ago, in a sober and heartfelt address to our community, President Aoun outlined an ambitious agenda for our university. As he put it, instead of being a microcosm of society, we need to be a model for society. It is through plurality that we live up to our highest calling, to be a community dedicated to human advancement. And it is in this spirit that the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, the Office of Student Affairs, and the Northeastern School of Law have organized a series of campus conversations over the last 4 semesters. Recognition of diversity and plurality is central to building a strong campus as well as a functioning society. And yet campuses, like other communities, can also be subject to efforts, sometimes from the outside, to sow conflict based on religion, race, ethnicity, citizenship, sexual orientation, or other individual traits. As you all know, Northeastern faculty and students are deeply engaged in studying the promises of diversity, as well as the roots of hatred and violence from a wide variety of perspectives, and they do so in numerous locations of the globe. Students and faculty also participate actively in local, national, and international efforts directed at preventing violence, resolving conflict, indeed at building peace. As members of the Northeastern community, we recognize that our work in the wider world can only be effective if we carefully reflect on our challenges at home. In fact, valuing diversity and building bridges across our differences are essential for establishing sustainable communities over the long term and for educating global citizens and global leaders. Our series is designed to elevate civility and ethical reasoning on campus and globally. Each event traces the arc from recognizing conflict or injustice to building peace. And I think you will see this arc today as our panelists reflect with you, the audience, on the broad issues that the killing of Michael Brown at the hands of Darren Wilson and the events that followed in Ferguson, Missouri, have raised. And I think we are all aware that even how we describe these events already has value undertones. These broad issues include trust in authority, they include profiling, they include questions of political representation, they also include the role of the media. It is wonderful to see so many students here because these conversations on broad and important issues can really only succeed with strong student participation. Our ambition is for Northeastern to be a pioneer and leader in what the organizing committee for the series has called civic sustainability, and I think that's a term that you have heard more and more on campus. Our working definition of civic sustainability has several key features: to practice civility while engaging with diverse opinions, to acknowledge past and present problems, to broaden personal networks, and to find common ground in social action. As we are pursuing these goals, we will do that with what we do best at Northeastern, to combine intellectual rigor and academic research with experiential learning, and to do this with attention to both the local and the global. It's then my pleasure to introduce Laura Wankel, who's the Vice President of Student Affairs, and Jeremy Paul, who is the Dean of the School of Law, who will each say a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Uta. I simply want to add my voice of welcome to all of you this evening. I think that the series has been an important exercise for all of us who have been collaborating around many difficult and complex topics. Certainly the Division of Student Affairs is happy to be an active participant in it, and it allows us to do what university communities do best, to become a forum, to actually be the forum that can explore complex ideas, varying perspectives, and advance knowledge. So I thank you all for being here, and certainly my partners in helping us bring these series forward.
Well, thank you, Laura. The law school is delighted to be part of this series on civic sustainability. and the issues that our distinguished panel will wrestle with tonight challenge us all. I think one thing that distinguishes our current situation for people from my generation is that to some extent we believed that at the end of the day, facts could serve to resolve a lot of these conflicts. So after all, either someone had a gun or they didn't, they were speeding or they weren't. But one of the things I think that we've learned effectively from all of you is that facts are hard to come by, and that people who are wearing green lenses will see something as green, and no matter how hard you tell them that it's red, it'll still seem green to them. And people are getting their lenses now from all kinds of places. In particular, some people watch one kind of media, other people watch another kind of media, and it's very difficult to learn how to change your color of your lenses so you can see things from a different perspective. And one of the reasons why the law school is so proud to be participating in this series is that at a vibrant research university such as Northeastern, the students get to see many different perspectives and don very many different lenses so that you can get at least as close to the facts as possible. So we're delighted you all could be here, and we look forward to a great night. Thank you.
It is then my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, Ralph Martin. Ralph Martin is Northeastern University's general counsel and someone who has led efforts for civic sustainability in both the public and the private sectors. Ralph.
Thank you, Uta, and thank you for those remarks on behalf of those who have supported this very important series. So, as Uta said, I am the moderator for this evening, and in that regard, I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight. We have, as you can see, a full house, and it's important that you participate in this discussion that we intend to have tonight. So we're going to start off by having each of our panelists make some opening remarks that will hopefully serve as framing remarks for what we hope will be a lively and interesting conversation tonight. And during the question and answer session, as well as during the remarks delivered by our panelists, our aspirations are to tackle the difficult questions embedded in the Ferguson subject matter in a way that is both lively and respectful. And so in that regard, when we move to the question and answer period, I'd really like to urge the audience to embrace all of the notions and principles behind civility. And we definitely want to stay away from declarations, speeches, anything that might resemble a pontification, and really use it to engage each other and to engage the panelists. And so as the moderator of tonight's discussion, let me do something outside the realm of normal moderator practice and offer an opinion. I don't believe anyone in this room tonight knows exactly what happened in Ferguson, or truly knows what intents, biases, and fears, and in what order motivated Michael Brown and Officer Wilson. We weren't there, we weren't witnesses, and we have not been privy to the entire investigation. And the fact of the matter is, most people in this country don't really know what happened. But that doesn't mean that we can't be insightful about the issues that Ferguson has provoked or inspired many of us to think about. We have a panel that is comprised of astute observers of many of the dimensions that have emerged in the public debate about what happened during the course of the encounter and shooting on that August night in Ferguson. So let me introduce each of them to you before we begin our presentations and discussion. Amy Farrell is an associate professor of criminology and criminal justice, and among her areas of research is the subject of race, and its effect on police practices. Rick Ireland is a distinguished professor of criminology and criminal justice and the former Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and he has decades of legal and judicial experience analyzing stop and frisk procedures and other legal issues that the Ferguson case has raised. John Ports is a professor of political science and has spent time studying and commenting on the inherent tensions of leading and managing in urban environments, and he'll offer perspectives on how we promote meaningful public engagement within a democratic society to prevent instances of excessive police force. And finally, Sarah Jackson is an assistant professor of communication studies, and she has studied the role of mainstream and other media in exposing biases, inequality, and other overlooked factors in the public domain. Professor Jackson has also studied how race is covered in political campaigns. So let's get started. I'd first like to invite Professor Farrell to make some comments.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here today. I'd like to start off our discussion by situating some of my comments within a broader context of policing and questions of police legitimacy in a democratic society. In the wake of the shooting of Michael Brown by a Ferguson police officer, we witnessed, as a nation, very visibly, a legitimacy crisis within the Ferguson Police Department and arguably within local policing more broadly across the United States. The shooting of Michael Brown was not an isolated incident, as all of you know. Although data on the use of force by police officers is hard to come by and not systematically collected, we know that there are numerous, hundreds, of unjustified situations where the police use force, oftentimes deadly force, more often against people of color, particularly young men of color. Following the shooting by the Ferguson Police Department and surrounding police agencies engaged in a highly militarized response to protesters who were seeking answers from the police department and the government about a shooting that they perceived as unjust, and which outside observers, including the United States Justice Department, saw as potentially a serious civil rights violation. And I'd like to talk very briefly about these responses in the context of police accountability more broadly in the United States and the importance of community trust in policing. As Ralph started us off, there are many aspects of the situation under which Michael Brown was killed that are not known and may never be known. But there are many facts that we do know that are important to talk about that call into question the legitimacy of the Ferguson Police Department and support calls for reform. The Ferguson Police Department, as has been reported highly following this incident, have a 10-year history of engaging in disproportionate stops and searches of Black and Hispanic motorists that has been documented by the Missouri Attorney General's report, annual reports of traffic stops. For example, in 2012, 88% of the stops that were made by the Ferguson Police Department and 92% of the searches of motorists were of Black motorists, whereas Black residents of Ferguson are only 67% of the population. But potentially even more troubling than those numbers, and that pretty much represents the 10-year trend, there hasn't been much deviation from that, is the fact that year after year, Ferguson police officers were consistently more likely to find contraband and make arrests following stops of white suspects compared to non-white suspects, which is surprising to most people. 36% of searches of white suspects yielded contraband compared to 24% of searches of Black suspects. And what this leads us to believe and raises question about is whether or not the police in Ferguson, and a pattern that we've seen replicated all across the country, have a lower standard or threshold of suspicion that is applied in searches of Black and Hispanic motorists, and therefore searches of non-white motorists are less productive. It raises questions about the process of searching, not just whether or not it's racially biased, but also questions about its effectiveness. The overwhelming majority of the Ferguson Police Department is white in a city that is overwhelmingly non-white, and the leadership and command of the Ferguson Police Department are almost entirely white males. In the wake of the Brown shooting, residents complained that what happened represented something that they saw as decades of disproportionate targeting of African Americans for stops and searches, often quoting that they felt more occupied than policed. This question of occupation was particularly important when we saw the militarization of the response that occurred after protests began in Ferguson's. Commenters looking at the situation at Ferguson have made suggestions about how local police forces have become occupying forces who rely on technology, computer modeling, and strategies that employ military resources as opposed to relationships with the community. Evidence of this trend, and this is not a trend in Ferguson, this is a trend that we see nationwide. The police move further and further away from a model of community policing that developed in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, where the police began to solve crimes by working in partnership with members of the community, building goodwill and trust among members of the community, and became more effective at reducing crime. In the last 2 decades, the police nationwide have begun moving further away from that. Part of that can be evidenced in a recent ACLU report on SWAT usage in the United States, where they reported dramatic increases in the use of SWAT teams, which are designed to handle critical incidents that are in fact inappropriately being used in over 80% of the cases to serve warrants, mostly drug warrants, mostly on African American and Hispanic residents. Right? So this highly militarized tactics designed for critical incident response is what we're training officers disproportionately in the United States to focus on, as opposed to building and engaging in community dialogue and community relationships. This is a dangerous trend. Public trust of the police is central to policing in a democratic society. We expect the police to be subject to the rule of law, as opposed to being beholden to the wishes of a few, to intervene in the life of citizens only under limited and carefully controlled circumstances, and to be transparent and publicly accountable. And when the police do not have that transparency and public accountability, the public loses trust. And fundamental principles of democratic policing become violated. Research confirms time and time again that when the public does not trust the police and does not have confidence in the police, their ability to police citizens is less effective. The public is more likely to obey the law. The public is more likely to respond to police commands. The public is more likely to participate with the police in problem-solving efforts when they have the support and confidence of the public. So I think our challenge tonight is to think about the events in Ferguson within the broader context of police legitimacy and the importance of trust and confidence in the police in a democratic society. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Judge Ireland.
Thank you and welcome to everyone. As a lawyer and a judge, I want to talk briefly about 2 things that come to mind when I think about Ferguson. First, I want to talk about the law that governs stop and frisk. You can think of it as the policy that governs the police, or you can think of it as the rules of police engagement. And the second thing I want to talk about briefly is the fact that there was a clear lack of diversity within the police department in Ferguson, with only 3 out of 53 police being minority. First, as to the stop and frisk policy, the law is that the police must have a reasonable suspicion that the suspect has committed a crime or is about to do so in order to justify a stop. And by the way, the rule is also that police cannot pat down a person unless they believe that the person is armed and presently dangerous. One of our leading Massachusetts cases says this about search and seizure. Such an investigatory stop is constitutionally justified if it is conducted on reasonable suspicion that the person seized has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime. That suspicion must be grounded in specific, articulable facts and reasonable inferences drawn therefrom, rather than from a hunch. And the name of the case is Commonwealth versus Scott. Of course, we all understand that the police must be able to investigate crime, but at the same time, we understand that the public should be free from unfair and intrusive behavior by the police. Now, as to the lack of diversity in Ferguson, I would like to suggest to you that we not just think about the lack of diversity in the police department, but we look at the broader legal spectrum, that it would include our courtrooms, that would include the lack of diversity among the judges, among the court clerks, the court officers, and the probation officers who deal with the public on a daily basis when they wind up in court. And so with that ideas, or those two ideas, I will just stop there and hope that we'll discuss those during the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening. I'm going to build off of the politics part of the title for this panel, and I'm going to cast my comments in a rather broad light. Let me start, though, by posing a question. As tragic as it is there in Ferguson what political scientists might refer to as a window of opportunity? From my political lens, is it an opportunity to develop meaningful citizen engagement in public governance? And that's what I want to focus my comments on. Citizen engagement in public governance. That's something that I think is central to our democratic society at all levels of government, national, state, and local, and certainly at the urban level in Ferguson and communities across this country. So at the risk of simplifying, which is what we do in 5-minute talks, let me focus on two contexts or settings in which I think engagement, this public engagement, can take place. The first one is what I think of as an institutional setting. It's the elections and the structure of local government. Representative democracy would be a term political scientists would use. Ferguson has a council-manager form of government, which is quite typical for a community of 21,000, that size. So they have the manager on one side who provides the administrative, professional administration, and they have a council on the other, the representative body for the citizens of that community. It's a ward-based system. 3 wards, 3 geographic areas, each of which elect 2 individuals to that council. And then they have a mayor who has a citywide constituency. It's an important question in a community as to whether it structures itself on a ward basis or in some cases on an at-large where councilors are elected citywide. Just take Boston, where we are right now, as an example. If you go back a little over 100 years, the city council in Boston has changed 4 times. It started off in 1909 as an at-large 9-member body where the focus was on citywide concerns. People were concerned. No neighborhood representation. 15 years later, they switched it to 22 wards. Each ward electing a city councilor. Neighborhoods are represented. It's too parochial. 15, 20 years later, they changed it back to 9 at large. Same arguments came up. 1983, where we are today, we have 9 district and 4 at large. We have the hybrid combination. But communities, Ferguson, other communities, have to think about what's the structure of their government, their representation, and how does that meaningfully map onto kind of the demographics of that community. And then it's also important how the processes take place, how that elected body conducts itself. And from what I can see, I have to say it's from a distance, but the city council in Ferguson is a group that has been criticized quite strongly by a variety of different groups around open meetings issues and a couple of other very important kind of democratic principles. So some very important challenges there. Benjamin Barber, a political scientist, refers to this representative democracy as thin democracy. He would argue for a second level or second context, what he refers to as strong democracy, public engagement, public deliberation, where citizens become problem solvers rather than spectators, where you try to build common ground, connecting to the community, forums, study circles, focus groups, different ways in which that can be structured. There are some organizations that may have heard of the National Issues Forum that works in communities across the country to highlight important national issues, immigration, race, equality. And then sometimes the focus of this deliberation is more on local use issues, redevelopment of space, for example. And there are many organizations that try to foster this kind of deliberation in communities. Massachusetts has an Office of Public Collaboration that's run out of UMass Boston, the Kettering Foundation, the Public Agenda Foundation. An interesting example I want to just highlight for one moment is something referred to as participatory budgeting, where local citizens get together and actually try to allocate part of an operating or capital budget. They brainstorm ideas. They come up with a package of projects, and then the community votes. Just last month in Vallejo, California, the community allocated $2.4 million for 8 projects based on this citizen from the bottom up participation. Boston has experimented just this year with a youth-centered process where they allocate $1 million in capital monies based on a youth vote. Cambridge, across the river, is looking at a pilot for $500,000 in capital spending. This notion of kind of strong democracy is what Barber refers to as kind of politics as a way of living. Let me go back to my question. Is the Ferguson situation, is there a window of opportunity? I hope so, but it's clearly very difficult. It's a very challenging environment, very sharp racial divisions in that community, legal investigations going on, pending indictment, et cetera. How do you build legitimate and sustainable efforts to enhance democracy in that kind of environment? There's a flurry of activity going on. About a month ago, the governor, Nixon in Missouri, created the State Office of Community Engagement. Just a few days ago, the governor established something called the Ferguson Commission. It's going to be 15 members. He hasn't appointed those people yet. Who those people are very important. But to look at the situation and think about charting a path for the future. So Ferguson has a real challenge, and other communities face a challenge too. But in Ferguson, I think they need to think about that thin democracy, the representative democracy. Are there ways to restructure that? And then trying to build strong democracy in a very challenging environment. I think that's a challenge for all the communities across the country. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all for being here, and thank you for my fellow panelists' comments. I'm really excited about the potential for the conversation that we can have tonight. So I want to start out by saying that as a scholar who researches the way that we communicate about race and social change and how that communication influences social and political ideologies and structures, I'm approaching this conversation from a little bit of a different framework than maybe some of what we've heard so far tonight. I want to take up the broader themes of this series, conflict, civility, respect, and peace, and suggest that in order to get to the latter three, civility, respect, and peace, the first, conflict, is not only important but necessary. While certainly conversations about the need for political change from within institutions is important to addressing issues like racial profiling and the misrepresentation and underrepresentation of Black and brown youth in American civil society, we also need to recognize protest as a crucial form of democratic expression. I believe we need to more fully embrace what civil rights legend John Lewis calls making righteous trouble. In the wake of the killing of Michael Brown, we saw residents of Ferguson and their allies take to the streets and demand to be seen and heard. Some in the media and with institutional power told us that these people were troublemakers, and in doing so, dismissed a practice that is at the very core of social progress. Protesters in Ferguson and others across the nation who refuse to be silent and rather insist on the right to be heard no matter how inconvenient or uncomfortable it is for those who have more access to traditional forms of governments are absolutely engaging in trouble, but this is righteous trouble. So, as a community and a country, I think we must be cautious about not dismissing or denigrating public expressions of dissent, anger, sadness, desperation, etc., that arise from communities that have been so systemically excluded, ignored, and preyed upon. In fact, the very nature of our democracy is dependent on the voiceless taking to the streets and demanding to be heard in ways that make the status quo uncomfortable. Our celebrated American Revolution, the abolitionist movement, the suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the feminist movement, and so on, did the very opposite of not causing trouble. They caused conflict, right? They caused conflict with a purpose. So members of these movements were derided in the media of the time. They were often constructed as troublemakers. They were often constructed as being un-American, being unreasonable, being too radical, and they were often told that they should depend on institutions to air their grievances, even as these very institutions excluded them. And in retrospect, we know that all of these movements were morally just, right? And so had these folks taken a seat as they were told, had they tried to work institutionally instead of causing trouble, we might not be in the place that we are today, right? So just as Nelson Mandela was once called a terrorist, some in elite spaces have called the young people in Ferguson who have taken to the streets and social media to push for basic recognition of their humanity, thugs and rioters, and have suggested that they are causing chaos, when in fact what they are causing is an important conversation, like this one, about the things that create the chaos in their lives, and those things need to change. So I believe that we should be reflecting on this deeply. I suggest that we should reflect deeply on whose voices are included and excluded from conversations about American politics, and think of how we can include and elevate voices that are often left out. In the case of issues of racial profiling and police brutality, we clearly need to work harder in our own communities to elevate the voices of young, working class, Black and brown people. These are the people who are most affected by issues of racial profiling and police brutality. I hope the organizers of this panel will forgive me for pointing out that we haven't exactly included those voices here tonight. Perhaps we must reconsider traditional ways of thinking that insist it is solely elites and institutionally sanctioned experts like ourselves who have the solutions we need in moving towards civility, respect, and peace, and instead listen more carefully and compassionately to those most vulnerable in society. Finally, I think perhaps one of the most hopeful developments to come out of Ferguson is that young and disenfranchised people in America, those groups who have always been at the forefront of lighting fires for social change, have been able to use new tools and technology, particularly in the case of Ferguson, Twitter, to influence our conversations and to draw attention to their experiences and to organize activism and social change efforts. Research that we're conducting right here at Northeastern University in my department, Communication Studies, shows in fact that it was not journalists or politicians or even community leaders who were at the epicenter of the conversation we are having now about Ferguson, but it was Michael Brown's peers. Our data shows that it was 17 and 18-year-olds who saw their friend's body lying in the street for hours, who were outraged, who started the righteous trouble that has resulted in Ferguson. They were the first ones to tweet the images. They were the first ones to tell the story. They were the first ones to create that network that has become this broader conversation in our society. So I'd like to suggest that we encourage rather than discourage some of the types of conflict that we have seen as a result of what has happened in Ferguson, and that in fact this conflict is necessary and the creation of righteous trouble is necessary if we are to move towards a more just and peaceful society. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their insights and their perspectives. And in a moment, I'm going to ask each of them to as they choose, respond to the perspectives that each of them shared with each other and with the audience. But in an effort to try, and not exclusively, but to try and tease out for us what some of the, at least some of the important themes might be. You know, Amy talked about the importance of police legitimacy. And, you know, one of the things we might consider this evening is in the face of all of this divisiveness, what has to be done for that police department and other police departments to regain their legitimacy. Rick Island talked about not only the rules of engagement relating to stop and frisk, but also the lack of black representation within the police department and other government institutions. You could say that that takes us to a broader plane of governmental legitimacy. And what are the next steps, short-term, medium-term, that government might engage in order to achieve that higher aspiration? And then John talked about this being a window of opportunity. And that is a grand aspiration that something restorative and maybe even transformational comes out of this window of opportunity, if indeed it is a window of opportunity. Or is it a long-term state of despair? And then Sarah talked about the importance of using conflict, this righteous trouble, to gain a larger purpose, and that it is something that is often necessary and indeed needed in order to get to this higher level of engagement, respect, and civility. So let me start off, Amy, since you started first, your reaction to that and other themes that were raised.
Son? Oh, thank you. There's a lot of overlap between the panelists today, and I'm looking forward very much to the conversation from the audience. It's clear, I think, that there's two major themes that we would like to discuss in some more depth. One is questions about how people in the public, particularly underrepresented or unrepresented or silenced voices, are heard and are part of the democratic process. And secondly, how institutions can actually respond to those voices. We have developed institutional mechanisms not to hear things and not to be responsive. And many of the mechanisms that we held great hope for in terms of making change have not worked. I think about what could be done after Ferguson, and was asked this question by someone, and went back to the Kerner Commission report, went back to an entire series of reports that have been done about every 20 years when an incident like this occurs. And the recommendations of those reports are the same, and they would be the same things we would echo today. And I think it raises questions about this state of being distressed, dismayed. That change is very difficult, even in these emotional times.
Rick?
Well, I have a bias.
Can you hear Rick back there? Yeah, you're on.
I have a bias, which is, as a judge for quite a long time, it seems to me that the courts should be looked to as a way to address the conflict that is occurring. The voices are being heard, but they're not going to be resolved on the streets. I think people have to think of the court as a place where you can get relief, and that requires the legal system to be responsive. And back to my point about diversity within the legal system, we need people of color who are lawyers and who are court officials, who participate in helping the court system resolve these things. We need lawyers who will speak up for those who can't speak. And we also need to participate in the political process. That means people need to vote. People need to be registered. They can't just sit on their hands. They have to go and be heard politically. My information is that not a large percentage of folks in Ferguson participate in the political process. And I happen to believe that the politicians respond to people who vote. That's my thought.
Thank you.
Let me add, I guess the notion of, is it a window of opportunity or is it a ongoing path of despair? I don't know exactly how you phrased it, but I think that poses an interesting question. I would like to think of it as an opportunity, but as you say, we have a pattern of kind of revisiting these issues and questionable as to whether there's really meaningful change. I guess it raises in my mind, do we have the political courage across the spectrum? Recently I was just kind of reviewing some of the conversation, the dialogue, the reporting on Ferguson, and I have to be, I'm struck by the kind of back and forth between, and the bickering and the fighting between the governor and the county and the city and the federal authorities get involved, and kind of we like one step forward, two steps back sometimes. And so it makes me, from a political scientist perspective, although I'm a fan of federalism, I sometimes wonder if that kind of division of responsibilities creates more problems than it solves. But I still come down, the opportunities at the local level I think are very important. But I think Ferguson has some real challenges, and I think you're right. The voting, it doesn't surprise me from what I've read of the kind of political process there. It's not a very positive one, and I can see why voters or why citizens would kind of see it as not representing them.
I'm really glad that Amy mentioned the Kerner Commission report. For those folks who aren't familiar with it, it was a report done by the federal government in 1968 after the widespread civil unrest that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King. And Lyndon Johnson wanted to understand why this unrest happened. Why did people in urban centers feel so disconnected from their governments and from power? And two of the main findings of the reports were essentially that, one, the media played a really significant role in this, that the media were not representing the voices or experiences or concerns of entire groups of the American population, particularly poor urban communities of color, and that as a result, these folks felt like they did not have an outlet for representation sort of in the greater American public sphere. And of course, one of the other findings was about the sort of treatment by politicians and police within these communities, where again, members of these communities were feeling disenfranchised and were feeling victimized by the people who were in fact supposed to be protecting them. And as Amy pointed out, what's really interesting about that is a very similar study was done after the riots that followed the acquittal of the police who brutally beat Rodney King in Los Angeles in 1994. Am I getting that right? Yes, okay. And basically they said the same thing. Basically they said, oh, remember what we said the problems were during the Kerner Commission? Well, they're still the problems, right? And I think when we look at, if somebody's like, well, what are the problems, right? Why do the people face these issues? Why do they feel disenfranchised? I think we're going back, we're finding this pattern repeating itself. And so, I think it's interesting because I have hope because we see these opportunities where young people in particular are using new outlets to create a more sort of democratized public sphere where their voices can't necessarily be completely ignored. But, as Amy pointed out, these structures have been sort of created for so long that it's very difficult just through one incident or in one community to break those down. So I think that that's a really interesting sort of framework for what we're thinking about tonight.
So in a former profession of mine, I got to know someone else who was in the same profession, and he had a way of describing community. And his description was, the perfect example of community is shared joy and pain. And it's very simple, but you get it right away. And what we have with Ferguson being the most recent exemplar, but there are plenty of other exemplars, is no shared notion of common joy and pain. It's been divided along racial lines, it's been divided along governmental lines, it's been divided along socioeconomic lines, and there are people in that community who will view it as a loss if Officer Wilson is indicted, and then there are other members of the community who will view it as a loss if he's not indicted. And that's their view of success in this immediate undertaking. But one of the things that I think is great about tonight's discussion is we've elevated the conversation and we've elevated the analysis to something larger, whether it's public legitimacy, whether it's how do you reconcile the differences and bring the community together. That really is what this nation should be about and what this discussion should be about. So at this point, I'd like to invite people to come to the microphone. We ask you to do two things. Tell us who you are and tell us what your question is.
25 years ago this month, the Boston police was somewhat delegitimized due to its response to the murder of Carol Stewart. I wonder if one of the panelists, probably Professor Farrell, or any one of you, could address what measures were taken to mend police-community relations in Boston and with what success.
I feel like we should actually ask one of our audience members to come up. One of the authors of that report is actually here, Jack McDevitt, who sat on the commission and authored the report that came out of that incident to reform the police department. So you can correct me about the ways that I misspeak here. But it's a very important event to bring up the Charles Stewart situation. So for those of you who did not read the recent Boston Globe article about it or don't remember the event, this is a situation where in Mission Hill 25 years ago, a white man murdered his wife, his pregnant wife, leaving the hospital, and claimed that a young black man had shot his wife. And the police turned the city upside down and arrested many young black men and interrogated them and kept them detained for days, searching for this terrible killer of an innocent white woman in Mission Hill. And Charles Stewart committed suicide by jumping off the Tobin Bridge a few weeks later, yeah. And it slowly came out that he had in fact fabricated this entire story. But the police were not suspicious of Charles Stewart. This fit into what was happening 25 years ago in the city's view of where crime was, that dangerous people were in Mission Hill, and that young men of color were dangerous, and that the police had every right to violate civil liberties in the process of achieving this greater good of protecting people from the harms in that community. And those harms there was violence in the community, there was crime, but there was huge amounts of police mistrust in that community. And a lot was done to help mend that trust. There was a series of police commissioners who came in who took seriously the recommendations of that report, which were to increase the diversity of the Boston Police Department, which were to increase the accountability and transparency of the Boston Police Department, which to hold accountable the actions of the police department through civilian review, and most importantly, to implement true community policing. And I think we're now in a situation where a recent report has been released by the ACLU that calls into question that history, whether we've moved away from progress that may have been made in Boston and are regressing, as many departments are across the country, back into a situation where the police become engaged in policing in an occupying force way, where it is an us versus them, where they're not serving the community that they police, but they are occupying the community that they police.
And I conducted the federal civil rights investigation into the Boston Police Department at the time. And so everything Amy says is correct. One friendly amendment and then some follow-on analysis. One, if you weren't here, you cannot appreciate what a stunning, horrifying incident this was. And so let me just confess that as an African-American male, when I was reading the transcript, the next day, reading the transcript of the 911 conversation, I kept thinking to myself, I hope it's not a black guy. Why? Because the city at that time was primed to just get overturned. And it was allegedly a black guy. And so what I later learned during the course of the investigation is that there were two detectives in the Boston Police Homicide Unit who thought Charles Stewart was lying. And they stifled him. They sat on those two guys. And later, really through a congruence of unforeseeable events, people learned that Charles Stewart was lying. So Amy's right about the subsequent police commissioners, but it was more fortuitous, in my mind, than planning. Because the then mayor, who was very resistant to community policing, brought in from New York City a guy whose name you may have heard, Bill Bratton, to be the superintendent-in-chief to the then police commissioner, who, to be frank, had no interest in community policing. And then another fortuitous thing happened. Mickey Roach decided not to run, Ray Flynn decided not to run for mayor and left to go to the Vatican. Tom Menino was elected and appointed Bill Bratton as commissioner. And that started the beginning of community policing in Boston. Paul Evans continued the legacy. The thing that I would sort of ask people to remember is, one, how sometimes fortuitous or circumstances or luck can create an opportunity, because it wasn't foreseeable that Ray Flynn was not going to run for re-election. The other is how fleeting it can be, how dependent it is on people who are committed to a certain ethic and set of guiding principles, who will doggedly pursue it, and how quickly it can evaporate when they're gone.
Me. Hi, I'm Jamie Brennan, and thank you all for being here. I respect all of your guys' work. A few weeks ago, I attended the open classroom called Civil Justice, Who Sues Whom, and one of the speakers was talking about how, even though it's such a litigious nation, rarely anything goes to court, and if anything is going, it's such a minuscule percentage, like something like less than 9. And so it would seem as though they disagreed with what you said, Judge, where it should go to the courts to get settled and so people can have justice. But with such little cases actually going to the courts and people, looking to them for answers, how do those people find happiness? I mean, it can't always be through settling, because it's really like the lesser of two evils, so it seems. Thanks.
Well, I stand by my earlier statement. I think the court system is society's best bet for a resolution. I will use as an illustration busing here in Boston. People complained about the situation with the school systems for years. Just complaining didn't change things. they had to go to federal court, and they did. And a judge responded with giving an order that there should be busing in the city of Boston. It was not a popular decision, but it was a decision that the judge felt was the right decision for the city. So I would say that on any kind of issue that would raise questions about the denial of civil liberties or something like that, that a person, much better, sorry, that a person still would have their best bet would be in a court of law.
Next.
Hi, I'm Sonia Banaszczyk. I'm an undergraduate student here at Northeastern. So a lot of the unrest and anger that we've seen in Ferguson was fanned by the responses of both the St. Louis and the Ferguson police departments in the aftermath of the murder of Michael Brown. So they've been viewed as protecting and upholding dominant power structures that disproportionately target low-income people of color. So people like Sean King have played a really key role in sharing information about it to the public and kind of synthesizing what's really been happening. So I guess I wanted to ask if any of you would be willing to speak more to the role of citizen journalism right now and what potential it has to influence civil discourse and maybe even institutional change, and maybe some challenges that come with that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll take that one. Thank you, that's a great question. You know, I think, as I mentioned in my comments, I think that one of the hopeful things that comes out of Ferguson, and not just Ferguson, but other sort of recent underreported incidents, so for example, the Trayvon Martin case, in which nobody in the mainstream media paid attention until people sort of took, citizen journalists and members of the community took to the internet and in other ways kind of made a fuss, right? And so I think that citizen journalism is clearly playing a really important role in our democracy right now, right? We are seeing stories being told and spread through networks because of the internet that simply were invisible and were not able to be told or able to reach as wide of an audience at other points in history. And so I think that, you know, people like Sean King, who, for those of you who don't know, is a prolific tweeter and resident of, engaged in for the politics of Ferguson, Missouri, who's constantly tweeting about sort of what the state of the investigation with Michael Brown is, what the police are doing, what the protesters are doing, et cetera, are really giving all of us this amazing insight sort of on the ground that I think we first really experienced when the Arab Spring happened, right? When there was a revolution in Egypt and we could be on our computers watching it because people were tweeting photos of themselves standing in front of tanks, right? And so we've really seen this incredible moment where we do have more democratic access to creating and dispersing and accessing information. I think with all that said, there are sort of two cautionary things about that, right? One is that citizen journalism can sometimes be wrong, right? Sometimes the people who are in the moment, on the ground, witnessing something just like anybody else, right, have a subjective perspective. And let me be clear, mainstream journalism and regular journalism has a subjective perspective too, right? But for sure, there can be misunderstandings, right? So we know after the bombing of the Boston Marathon, right, there were several moments in which citizen journalists had decided that they knew who the bomber was, and as a result, there were people who were accused and, you know, raked across the coals and all sorts of stuff, and that information wasn't accurate. So I think certainly mainstream and sort of traditional journalism still has the ethical responsibility to double check and sort of do the investigative work before simply picking up stories that, you know, anyone can get on the internet and create, which is of course not to undermine those stories at all, because I think they're very, very important. My second cautionary thing is just that maybe we shouldn't be too optimistic about that, because I think while certainly these stories are able to be told in spaces, in online spaces, in places like Twitter, et cetera, that doesn't mean everyone is paying attention, and in fact, most people in America aren't paying attention. So those stories are getting told, but the question of who is hearing them, what ears are the information reaching? Are politicians and lawmakers taking things that people tweet seriously? I mean, that's a different set of questions in terms of what actual sort of impact for that information, is having. So that's what I.
My name is Alex Jones. I'm a first-year law student here at Northeastern. And my question for anyone who'd like to answer it is relating to the coroner's report that was leaked a few days ago from the county coroner. And this was interpreted by many to validate the officer's view of the events and his version of the events. And my question is, how can we avoid letting a situation like that derail the conversation? And because this situation is both about Michael Brown and not about Michael Brown. It's about something that's so much more than Michael Brown. So how do we make sure that the conversation is not just about Mr. Brown and his tragic death, but also about the situation that led up to that, and not letting the facts on the ground completely derail that conversation?
But Amy, you want to start that one?
That's an excellent question. And I think what your remark about the fact that this is about Michael Brown and not about Michael Brown is so incredibly important, which is that what happened, regardless of the factual situations, which, again, we don't know, we may never know all the details of. There's a counter narrative to that coroner's report, right? We could get into the weeds about talking about those narratives and counter narratives and who controls that narrative. The fact is that a young man has been killed. The fact is that a community has been thrown into disarray. And, there are situations where the police are using force that we can control and that we should control, and that as a country we have a right to understand and that has to be transparent. And there are also terrible incidents that will happen. And as communities, when our community disintegrates because of those incidents, which we hope never happen, but things do happen, and they will continue to happen. And sadly, it will be a few more months before we have another one of these situations that happens. That is the pattern that we are witnessing. In fact, we've had situations since then that have not been made into into mainstream media. But what was so important about Ferguson was the fact that the community responded in such a way that we saw the anger of the community so viscerally. And so the conversation is really about this notion of community trust. In a situation where a community and a police department have a great deal of trust, and there is a situation where something bad happens, right? And I don't want to go into whether that bad thing is justified or not justified, but bad things do happen. When that does happen, you want to be able to have your community standing next to you saying, we are working this out together, we are trying to figure out what's happening, we as a community trust that you as an institution will do the right thing in figuring out what went wrong and who needs to be punished for that thing happening if someone needs to be punished. When a community does not trust their police, you get Ferguson, right? And that is what we can prevent. That is what we have to move towards. And we can't get lost in the weeds of the exact situation inside that car. We have to have the conversation about why it is that there is such great distrust and what it is that has worked in the history of policing in Ferguson and in many other communities across the United States that breeds that distrust. That's what we can fix, I think.
John?
I would just, I think you're right, and I would add to that I mentioned before that this Ferguson Commission was created by the governor of Missouri a couple of days ago. I think there's a potential. I mean, maybe it will produce something that just says what everybody expects, but to me, there's the potential for something like that, if it's done well, to kind of carry the conversation and look beyond this incident. Because whether someone's indicted or not indicted and all that, that's important. But the fact of the matter is there's a community there with serious problems. And it's not the only community that has those problems, but it has very serious issues there. And they need to kind of look at those issues. What's the nature of those issues and how do they address them? And that's not something that's going to be resolved in 1 month or 2 months or 1 year. And so, the question becomes, beyond the incident, after the incident, moving forward, this commission does its report in 6 months or something like that, then what happens? And who among the political people there and the community has the political courage to kind of keep the ball going?
Just, again, from my perspective as a judge, it would seem to me that a judge could issue a gag order and instruct people not to release autopsies or police reports or any other statements that would affect the grand jury proceedings in this matter. So that would be another route.
You know, there's an inherent tension in the day-to-day investigation and defense of these kinds of cases. The leaks that you heard about, that's part of the constant ebb and flow of managing these cases. But I think our commentators, our panelists, are right about one essential thing, that unless there is a way, no matter what the outcome, of elevating the conversation into what did we learn from this, who owns what part of it, and who's going to go shoulder to shoulder in restoring the community, then in the end it's only going to be a discussion about who was indicted, who wasn't indicted, and there'll be so many unanswered questions that that community will be in upheaval for years. Sir?
Hello, my name is Roderick Kersey, and first and foremost, I am a Mission Hill, a 22-year Mission Hill resident and homeowner. Secondly, I am a 30-year former Northeastern employee. And last but not least, I am a CPS graduate student that left class to come and participate in this symposium. So my question is primarily for Assistant Professor Jackson, but anyone else can certainly chime in. And it's about your talk about righteous trouble, and I am certainly an advocate of that. But my question for you is, how do you think the city of Ferguson and the community surrounding it have handled the violence and the looting that has occurred? And what do you think are the best practices going forward for people that want to engage in righteous trouble without allowing it to sabotage the good work that can come out of that? Martin Luther King had to deal with it. Gandhi had to deal with it. So what do you think was the best practices that they used to do that?
I think that's a great question. And I think the honest answer to that question is that somebody who was from the community in Ferguson, who's been an activist there and who's been on the ground doing that work, would be best suited to answer that question. I can offer my from a distance commentary, which should be very much taken as not an expert commentary on that because I'm not there. But I think when it comes to the issue of what is, as you mentioned, has always existed in sort of any movements towards social change, there's always sort of the folks who are engaging in a certain type of very targeted activism, which is often civil disobedience that includes breaking the law, right? And then there are always sort of like a fringe that aren't the people who are interested in like the activism but are interested in the chaos. There always is, right? And you see that everywhere, right? You see that in any sort of protest or any sort of, right? But I think the thing that's important in terms of framing the story for the community that's trying to create change is for them to clearly communicate, one, that small minority of people who are, doing what, I hesitate to use the term looting just because I think it's so loaded, but who are engaging in what we would call unnecessary criminal activity, right, in the wake of these protests.
Unnecessary violence.
Aren't representative of their goals, right, or aren't representative of the mass of the public or of the people. And I think that at least in the spaces I've observed, I've seen community leaders in Ferguson make the case for that, and I think make the case for that well, that say, hey, look, there's always going to be people that come take advantage of a situation when a community's in disarray, but this isn't the core of what we're doing or the core of who we are, and you should pay attention to what we're talking about instead of paying attention to like the guy over there breaking into Walmart or whatever, right? And I think, unfortunately, the media, because one of the media's news values is to focus on conflict and to focus on criminality and to like make these very simplistic associations, oftentimes spends too much time focusing on that fringe element and not enough time really complexly interrogating the questions and the problems that are being raised by the core group of sort of troublemakers, right? And so, yeah, you know, I think it would be great if we had somebody, you know, in my dreams, we can like go, oh, actually, we have this person here on Skype who's been on the ground in Ferguson who can speak to that, but we don't have that, so.
Anybody else?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Akira Gilbert. I'm a second-year undergraduate student, and my question is primarily for Judge Ireland, but anybody else feel free to jump in. So you said that you believe that this issue will not necessarily be resolved by taking it to the streets, as Sarah recommended, but instilling faith in the judicial system, correct? So I was wondering what has led you to believe that either underrepresented, unrepresented, or silenced populations, such as the racial minority population in Ferguson, would take faith in the system that has proven to fail them time and time again, in the sense of multiple cases such as we have just relatively recently seen the switch in law from the distinction between crack and powder cocaine. We've had the Central Park 5, in which a group of African-American teenagers was blamed for the rape and murder of a white woman, when actually, and they spent many years in jail, whereas it turned out not even to be them. So I was just wondering what has led you to believe that this is possible in the foreseeable future, and if so, how we would get to that point?
Well, I didn't say that the legal system was speedy, but it will get it right eventually. And my experience is that that's the route for justice. It may be slow, it may take time, but over a period of time, I think the court system is the best option for those people who have claims of feelings of injustice. And I look at the civil rights, the whole flow of cases, Brown versus Board of Education. That took a long time, but finally justice was done. Now, if you're looking for instant justice, maybe the court system isn't what you turn to, but then what's your option? What do you look at? Where do you go? And so it seems to me the court system is the best route.
Yeah, and if I may,
with all its frailties and everything.
If I may chime in, I want to be clear that I don't think that righteous trouble alone can get us justice or can get us towards a more equal society, right? I think it's the necessary ingredient. But as Judge Ireland points out, right, if we look at something like the civil rights movement, it took people in the street. It took people putting their lives at risk. It took people being fire hosed down and attacked by police dogs. It took people sort of being willing to be out there causing trouble in order for the institutions to say, oh, maybe we should listen to these like people that are sitting across the table from us that think we should pass this bill, right? And so if it hadn't have been for the trouble, there would have been less motivation in terms of the legal system, in terms of institutions, for things like Brown versus Board of Education or the Loving case or other things to be passed. So these things work together, I think, right? And I don't think one can really work without the other necessarily.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that Sarah and Rick are saying is that you use every tool that's available to you, and we should at the same time recognize that there is a Federal Department of Justice investigation underway, a review underway, while all of these other things are going on. And we don't yet know what that will lead to. It could lead to monitoring. It could lead to a civil lawsuit. It might lead to either a criminal or civil rights investigation or indictment. So you use every tool that's available to you.
Hello. My name is Lola Akimbade. I'm a second-year student here at Northeastern. My question is open to anyone who wants to answer. So after the death of Mike Brown, there was conflict in opinions regarding the convenience store robbery that he committed on the same day as his death.
Could you just repeat that last?
After the death of Mike Brown, there was conflict over the convenience store robbery he committed the same day as his death. To what extent do you think this is relevant to the conversation, and how can we separate this after-the-fact information about Brown from the racial tensions that Ferguson represents and the issue of Black criminalization in general?
I would say in the situation of trying to understand if the shooting was justified or not, it's completely irrelevant. That in this particular situation, there seems to be clear evidence that the officer was not stopping Mike Brown for any particularized suspicion, that in many ways, I think the reason that the convenience store robbery, the only place that probably the convenience store robbery is relevant, is trying to understand why the police department released that information in the way that they did, which is that it was a tactic, and I think, you know, a pretty obvious one of trying to shift the conversation towards a public belief that this is a dangerous young Black man. And that the police would be justified in taking whatever actions that they needed to take against them, and to distract from the situation of a potentially unjustified use of force. So it is incredibly problematic in that way. And we've seen certainly other instances of that, where inappropriate behavior, unlawful behavior gets justified by the belief that the individual suspect, by virtue of their group identity, is in some way responsible for their own harm coming to them. And that's a very, very dangerous proposition. And I think we have to continue to keep that in the forefront of our conversation, which is to understand that that was done in a very calculated way and had a calculated reaction.
Anybody else? Okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hannah Casey. I'm a freshman communications major, and my original question was actually quite similar to the previous one, so I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. And specifically for you, Assistant Professor Jackson, because it is sort of a communications media type question, how do you expect the mainstream media's sort of characterizations of Mike Brown and Darren Wilson respectively to affect the indictment and potential trial?
It's a good question. You know, so there's some research on this in terms of how the way that media covers court cases can affect, particularly, I mean, the main concern is juries, right? But everyone, right? Because we're all sort of exposed to the messaging around that. And I actually think the folks on the panel who have worked in the law might even be able to speak to their perspective of how what influence that might have. But I certainly think in this case, you know, I think it depends, because I think as we've sort of discussed, there are people who get their information from the mainstream media from very different mainstream media, right? We all know that there's a very sort of polarized mainstream media at this point in America. Most people get their news from cable news, which is a very polarizing place, in case you haven't watched it lately. And so, you know, I think it sort of depends what the main sources of information are for the people who end up in positions of power to adjudicate what happened. But I think, you know, the ideal would be that all of these people gather information from multiple sources and have a diversity of information available to them from the media that sort of offers different perspectives and values and privileges, sort of different takes on this. That's not very realistic, because that's not how people consume media. And we also know that media tend to depend on elite sources for their information. So for example, media are much more likely to quote police sources than they are to quote, you know, an average citizen, for example. And so that very much sort of skews the information that's available. So I don't know, like I think it's a concern, but I think it's hard to predict for a particular case what the impact will be.
You know, so as someone who used to try cases, you know, I'll tell you that there are governmental efforts, and then there are defense attorney efforts to demonize where you can demonize. the sad part about that, and that's a tactic, the sad part about that is the public doesn't have a way to differentiate between tactics and some broader cultural or political effort. And so, you know, they don't parse it the same way. They see the big picture. And so, you know, Mike Brown is a human being, and he comes from a family. And, you know, he may or may not have had troubles, but we still don't know enough to say that what he did, you know, ended in a justified result. We don't know enough to say that, but there are people who are leaping to that conclusion based upon the demonization. And so, you know, what the media could do a better job of doing is saying, hey, wait a minute, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, but that conversation is not occurring in a generalized and mainstream way.
And if I could just add, if there's a trial, the judge will do everything that he or she can to make sure that the jurors are people who have not yet made up their minds. They will be asked if they've read or seen stories on television. Do they think that they could be neutral? Have they formed an opinion one way or the other? And the goal will be to try to identify jurors who have an open mind and have not yet made up their minds one way or the other in the case. And it might be a disqualification if a person says, oh yes, I've been following the guy on the ground who's been reporting every week about what's been going on in Ferguson. That might result in them not being able to sit as a juror in the case.
Sure.
Hello, I'm Christian Lopez. I'm a freshman at Northeastern. And my question is, having this be one of the steps in changing the violent protests in Ferguson, what do you think will be the next step in like changing this protest into a national movement in regarding like social media and civil action?
Well, it is a national movement. Thank you, Christian. It is a national movement. There's an organization called Black Lives Matters that has chapters all over the United States, including one in Boston, who are looking at issues of police profiling and brutality and looking at ways in which to institutionally create accountability in terms of policing and sort of get the stories of people who experience these things told. And so I actually think that that's one of the misnomers sometimes about the activism that follows these movements, is that this is just like a sudden spurt of activism and like nobody actually is paying attention or cares. There are people in this room, I recognize them and I see their faces, who are activists in Boston who have been working on racial justice issues for a very long time. And so I think maybe it's more about the rest of us paying more attention to them than anything else in terms of sort of recognizing where the next steps of the national movement or sort of larger questions of change might go. So
I want to be respectful of the time and the hour, and I don't want to cut anyone off, but I just ask that no one else get online here. We're going to try and take these 3 questions and wrap up. So I'll ask my panelists for their cooperation in providing as brief answers as possible. Sir.
So my name is Daniel. I'm also a freshman at Northeastern. In regards to mass incarceration, according to the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, 1,433,741 males are in prison. 55,300 are black males. So do you believe that the U.S. relies too much on prisons and should focus more on minimizing imprisonment in America?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was good. Sir?
Or were you just asking, or you're not going to respond?
Well, he said yes. We all agree.
Yeah, so this is kind of responding to my question as well. Given that the institution of the police is a relatively young institution, and drawing from Michelle Alexander again, one that was rooted very much so in the slave patrols of the 1700s and the 1800s, and maintains an incarceration of black men that is 5.5 times higher than South Africa during the height of apartheid. What are the alternatives that we can begin looking to create the kind of social interactions that we want to see and move towards an eventual abolition of an inherently racist and oppressive institution?
It's a great question. So I'll take a run at it since no one else is serving themselves up. You can start by splitting nonviolent offenders from repeat violent offenders. That's a fairly easy distinction to make. Then you can start by loading in the fact that, 70% or more of the nonviolent offenders are in prison because of drug-related or substance abuse problems. And how little as a society we invest in substance abuse rehabilitation. And then you can add on top of that the disproportionate sentences that are still meted out in many parts of the country for crack cocaine sentences versus powder cocaine sentences. And so I think if you then add to that the whole notion of gradual punishment. And so by that I mean, instead of going away in your first stint for 90 days or 120 days, maybe you go away for 5 days, and then you get a chance at rehabilitation. And then if you screw up, maybe you go away for 2 weeks. So, graduated punishment as opposed to, the stiff sanctions. So I think, there are lots of components of sentencing and rehabilitation that have existed in other countries that we haven't even tried yet.
Hi, my name is Chase Gray. I'm a third-year econ student, and my question kind of goes back to the beginning when we're talking about holding our police forces accountable for their actions. I bet if you asked everyone in this room if they could name any part of the Bill of Rights or even say everything about the Bill of Rights, I don't know if a handful of us could even get through that. Police forces are supposed to represent us, but we're in a part in our society where there's a lot of mistrust in our police force, our politicians, and everything that they're representing. Do you feel that in our education system, we should be taking better steps to move towards incorporating teaching the public the laws and having them hold a better understanding of what we as Americans are about and what we stand for, instead of just almost going through this analytical corporate farming system that we're in today?
Well, that was a loaded question.
Yeah, yeah. To the people who are part of the educational system, this is a quick answer, and I'll let somebody else take the part about whether we should be teaching the laws and the Bill of Rights. But I definitely think we need to be teaching young people in America about the value of causing righteous trouble. And I teach a class here at Northeastern on social movements, and I am shocked when I get classroom after classroom after classroom full of extremely bright, extremely well-educated students who have never learned about the anti-apartheid movement, for example, right? Or who never knew that Rosa Parks wasn't just tired and sat in the front of the bus, but was a activist in the NAACP who had orchestrated the entire thing for media attention, right? And so I definitely think our schools are failing students in not teaching the role that activism and really standing up and speaking out has played in history for sure.
If I could just follow up with that, I agree that we need to educate our young people about what their rights are and how our systems work. And I want to invite everyone who's here to think about taking a course in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. We have some great courses. You'll learn quite a bit about your rights. Thank you.
I can't let that go by from political science. I mean, I certainly agree with what's being said, but But, you know, just the basic political institutions. I have an 18-year-old daughter, and I have to confess, I mean, she asks me questions about basic government things. I teach this, and I'm just amazed that she was able to get through high school and know so little about American government. I'm embarrassed, I have to say. But, so, I mean, to your question, I mean, we certainly can do what you're talking about, but we need to do the basics as well. And I think that's all about, back to the comments I made about, you know, creating citizenship and creating capacity, citizen capacity to, you know, Ferguson is at the point where, I mean, it's a crisis situation there. Even the Michael Brown thing aside, it was a crisis. It was a crisis ready to boil over. And so we got places like that across the country. And you know, citizenship has failed in those communities, I would say. It's a strong statement. I think it's the case. And I think we need to think about how do you build citizen capacity? And you really need to build it from when things are not so bad. I mean, that's when you have some opportunity, or it's not as difficult. Although some people will say it takes a crisis to move forward, and I understand that as well. But we've got a big task just to build that citizen capacity.
Can I just say on the other end of that, these are all very important suggestions, and I think from the institutional end, there's education to be done as well. That is within law enforcement, if we take them as the example. It is about more than just teaching kids to assert their rights. It is about teaching law enforcement how to engage with the community. It's about teaching law enforcement about kids. It's about teaching law enforcement about how to have respect. It's about teaching law enforcement about the unconscious biases that they carry around with them and act upon. And there's a lot of education that needs to happen, not just of the public to assert their right, but of those institutions of power to be responsible to citizens.
Well, you are all invited to continue this important conversation at the reception that is taking place right outside of the door. And I want to thank once more our 5 panelists and the audience for an inspiring evening.